So Catelyn I is kind of a really odd chapter. We had the prologue and we had Bran 1, which were both kind of action-packed chapters. In the prologue, we had the 3 Men of the Night's Watch encountering the White Walkers, and then in Bran 1, we saw one of those men beheaded and they found the direwolf puppies. But in Catelyn 1, it's just a single conversation between her and Ned. Like with Bran 1, I kind of have theorized that the point of the chapter isn't necessarily to introduce us to Bran, but to Jon Snow as a character. And so with Catelyn 1, I think along with kind of moving the plot forward and giving us new information about what's to come, so far as Jon Arryn's death and Robert riding north to Winterfell, I think the point of Catelyn 1 is really to introduce the reader to the religions of this world. You know, in the prologue, you get Will praying to the nameless gods of the wood, and we don't really know who or what those are. But in Catelyn 1, we get the distinction between the religion of the north and the religion of the south. Catelyn, we learn, is from the south. She was born at Riverrun. She is a Tully. Catelyn had been anointed with the 7 oils and named in the rainbow light that filled the sept of Riverrun. She prays to the 7 faces of God. Worship was a septon with a censer, the smell of incense, a 7-sided crystal, alive with light, voices raised in song. So that all seems very inspired by the Christian religion. So Catelyn's basically Westerosi Catholic, and then Ned is like a pagan. So this chapter takes place right after Bran 1. So Ned has, beheaded Garrett, they found the direwolf pups, they rode back to Winterfell. She has news to deliver to him, and that's where she knows she's going to find him. But in her walking through the Godswood, we're getting all of this information about the religions of this world. And from a writing standpoint, I really love the way George conveys this information to the reader, because it's like, this chapter is definitely something that you would consider an info dump, but Catelyn, she could have had this conversation with Ned in their bedroom, or like they could have gotten this news of Jon Arryn's death like at dinner or something, but George chose to set the scene at the Godswood so that we could get this information about the religion woven through the scene. Hey guys, editing me jumping in here just because I forgot to mention a couple things when I originally made this video, so I'll be popping in periodically to kind of just elaborate on some points that I hadn't necessarily finished my thoughts on when I filmed this originally. So when I did my video on the prologue, I mentioned that George had originally planned A Song of Ice and Fire to be a trilogy. It was going to be this first book, A Game of Thrones, and that was going to be about the fight between House Stark and House Lannister. The second book in the series was supposed to be A Dance with Dragons, and that was going to be about Dany and the Dothraki's invasion of Westeros. And then the last book in the series was going to be The Winds of Winter, and that was of course going to be about the fight between the living and the White Walkers. So when you think about these early chapters through that lens, and knowing that like this book was supposed to have a lot more in it than we get at the end of the book, it makes so much sense that there is all of this information packed within these early chapters, because George thought that it was going to be a trilogy, and so he had to convey all of this information to the reader very quickly. But of course, as I mentioned in the video, even though George is giving the reader all of this information in a very compact chapter, I think Catelyn 1 is only I think it's less than 2,500 words, which is a very, very short chapter. Even though it's so packed with all of this world building, the way that George weaves it into the story is so seamless. And as a writer, that's something that I really appreciate, and that's something that I think a lot of writers can learn from, is what is the best way that I can maximize this scene so that I'm ensuring I am giving the reader all of the information that I need them to have, but at the same time you're not sacrificing the story for the info dump. And it's a different way of looking at setting and how you can use setting in a story. So my takeaway from this is I definitely want to be more mindful in the future of where I set certain scenes, because I think a lot of the time for me, setting is something that just kind of takes place in the background, and it's, you know, background description, but it can have a much more important purpose in the story. And, you know, rather than just focusing on the characters themselves and their interactions, because I think that's probably, for me when I'm writing, that's my biggest focus, is what is going on with the characters and what are they doing and what are they saying. But now I want to bring setting more into the story and give it more importance than I previously... Cat cameo. But yeah, I just want to be more mindful about every aspect of my story, and how can I use setting in a different way to make it more purposeful, to weave every aspect into storytelling all together, rather than having it all be kind of compartmentalized, like, here's the characters, this is what they're doing, here's the setting, this is what it looks like. No, how can you have all of these elements weave together to tell one story? So anyway, that's my takeaway. That's my cat. And back to the regular video. And because Catelyn isn't from the north, because she's from an entirely different part of Westeros than Ned, we're getting the differences between the two. We're getting all of this information about the faith of the Seven, and especially about the old gods, which Ned and the rest of the Starks follow. But we also learn that the Starks share this religion with the so-called Children of the Forest. And we don't really know who the Children of the Forest are yet, but we get a lot of information about the old gods. And we learn a lot about the weirwood trees in particular. A face had been carved in the trunk of the great tree, its features long and melancholy, the deep-cut eyes red with dried sap and strangely watchful. They were old, those eyes, older than Winterfell itself. They had seen Brandon the Builder set the first stone, if the tales were true. They had watched the castle's granite walls rise around them. It was said that the Children of the Forest had carved the faces in the trees during the dawn centuries, before the coming of the first men across the narrow sea. In the south, the last weirwoods had been cut down or burned out 1,000 years ago, except on the Isle of Faces, where the green men kept their silent watch. So that's a lot of fucking information to take in. So we get this really cool picture painted in our minds as to what the weirwood tree looks like, and we get the information that in Westeros, the first men weren't there originally. It was just the Children of the Forest, and the first men had come from across the narrow sea, which is a really interesting piece of information for George to convey to the reader in the second chapter, because of course, you know, basically everybody came from across the narrow sea. The first men were first, and then you had the Andals, and then you have the Targaryens coming in, you know, a couple hundred years before our story starts. But Stark fans always like to talk about, you know, the Targaryens don't belong in Westeros, they're colonizers. And we get in Catelyn II that the first men were colonizers as well. But regardless of everybody else forgetting that fact, I'm really glad to be rereading this chapter to remind everybody of this, that the first men were not native to Westeros. They came from across the narrow sea just like everybody else. But another really interesting piece of information, which is kind of a little bit contradicted later on in the story, is George noting that all of the weirwood trees in the south had been cut down and burned, except for on the Isle of Faces. And it's one of those, like, details, one of those pieces of information that is one more thing that makes me question why in the show Bran ends up in King's Landing. Like, that was never a place where it made sense for Bran to go, because if Bran still has his powers at the end, which in the show he definitely does, how can Bran see things if he doesn't have access to a weirwood tree? So just wanted to make note here that I know there's a lot of debate as to
the role that the werewood trees play in Bran's powers and Bran's visions. Like, obviously, he can see things beyond what the faces in the werewood trees can see. Like, he doesn't have to be looking through the eyes of a werewood tree in order to see something. But I still think it's up for debate whether or not Bran needs to be near a werewood tree in order to have a vision. Like, especially in the show, he's shown putting his hand to a werewood tree, or he is like seated near one or seated leaning up against one every time he has one of his visions. And in the books, this is from A Dance with Dragons. He's getting, lessons on how to be a green seer. And this happens. Close your eyes, said the three-eyed crow. Slip your skin as you do when you join with summer. But this time, go into the roots instead. Follow them up through the earth to the trees upon the hill and tell me what you see. All green seers are also skin changers. Bran being a green seer, instead of slipping into summer, he has to slip into a werewood. So, I don't know. It's up for debate. So regardless of him needing to be near a werewood tree or not, because they're so connected to his powers, I think it still doesn't make sense for him to wind up in a location where there are no werewoods. Back to the video.
So Catelyn's walking through the Godswood. She finds Ned sitting beneath the werewood tree cleaning ice after he, had just beheaded a guy. Ned asks Catelyn what the children are up to, and she says that they're in the kitchen arguing over names for the direwolf pups. She says that Arya and Sansa are totally in love with their puppies, but she says that Rickon, who is only 3 years old, is a little cautious, and Ned says this: he must learn to face his fears. He will not be 3 forever, and winter is coming. Yes, Catelyn agreed. The words gave her a chill, as they always did, the Stark words. Every noble house had its words, family mottos, touchstones, prayers of sorts. They boasted of honor and glory, promised loyalty and truth, swore faith and courage. All but the Starks. Winter is coming, said the Stark words. Not for the first time, she reflected on what a strange people these Northerners were. So this is the first time in the books that we get any mention of house words. We learn that every major house in Westeros has these kind of mottos attached to their family name. And I think it's interesting that we get the Stark words in the POV chapter of somebody who's not a Stark by blood. Yes, Catelyn is Catelyn Stark because she married Ned, but she's not from the North, and these really aren't her words. And I actually think that that's on purpose on George's part, because so Catelyn reflects that these Northerners are a strange people, but at the same time, even though Catelyn is from the South, even though Catelyn is of the faith, she's really one of the most perceptive characters in the entire story. And it kind of frustrates me reading this chapter again and her whole interaction with Ned, because Catelyn picks up on all of these little signs that Ned just fucking completely ignores. So Ned goes on to talk about the man who he beheaded, how the man died well, and he was thankful for Bran's sake, and how Catelyn should be proud of him. Catelyn says she's always proud of Bran. And then Ned says he was the 4th this year. The poor man was half mad. Something had put a fear in him so deep that my words could not reach him. He sighed. Ben writes that the strength of the Night's Watch is down below 1,000. It's not only desertions, they are losing men on rangings as well. Is it the wildlings? She asked. Who else? Who else? that Catelyn even asks if it's the wildlings, knowing that the only other option really aside from the wildlings attacking Night's Watchmen would be the White Walkers, is just really interesting. Catelyn is a really complicated character, but I fucking love her character too, because she's kind of like Jon Snow in the first chapter. Everybody else, when they saw the direwolf pups, were kind of freaking out and thinking that it was some weird bad sign, and Jon was the one who was thinking outside the box and thinking, no, wait, there are as many direwolf pups as there are Stark children. This is the sigil of House Stark. You guys were meant to have these direwolf pups. And so Catelyn isn't really a Stark either. You know, Jon is a Snow / secret Targaryen, but Catelyn isn't a Stark either. And she's also thinking on this level that no one else is. You know, Ned is thinking that it's the wildlings, and he goes on to mention Mance Rayder and how one day might come when he has to call the banners and march and deal with this king beyond the wall. And Catelyn fixates on that phrase, beyond the wall. Beyond the wall, the thought made Catelyn shudder. Ned saw the dread on her face. Mance Rayder is nothing for us to fear. There are darker things beyond the wall. So Ned is just totally fixated on this whole wildling thing because he doesn't believe in the White Walkers. You know, he tells her that she listens to too many of Old Nan's stories and that the others are gone and have been for thousands of years. They may not have even existed at all. And Catelyn is like, she's not taking any of Ned's shit. And out of all of the characters in the story, for her to be the one to not just brush it off, it just makes me love her character even more, because she's not from the North. And you would think that out of all the areas of Westeros, the people who would take those stories more seriously would be the people of the North. But it's Catelyn and not Ned who is thinking it might not be the wildlings that we should be afraid of. So that conversation kind of comes to its natural end, and Ned asks her what she's doing there because he knows that she doesn't like to be in the Godswood. So she just comes out and tells him, because there's no easy way to give him this information. She tells him that Jon Arryn is dead. His eyes found hers, and she could see how hard it took him, as she had known it would. In his youth, Ned had fostered at the Eyrie, and the childless Lord Arryn had become a second father to him. So this is definitely one of those lines that I think is a really, really subtle hint from George as to who Jon Snow is. We're only 3 chapters into the story. We've had the prologue, we had Bran 1, and now we have Catelyn 1. But in just those 3 chapters alone, we have 2 different characters with the first name Jon. Jon Snow and Jon Arryn, which from a writing standpoint, you would think is a really odd narrative choice. Like, we're only 3 chapters in and already you've got 2 characters with the same first name. So, you know, if you're not thinking about it, on first pass it might just seem kind of lazy of George to just give these 2 characters the same first name. But when you think about who Jon Arryn is to Ned, it makes so much sense. Because Ned, you know, you learn Ned fostered with Jon Arryn, that Jon Arryn was like a father figure to him, but he wasn't Ned's actual father. And we know that Ned isn't Jon Snow's actual father. He's his uncle. And you also learn in this chapter that Jon Arryn had protected Ned and Robert Baratheon, who was also fostering with him at the Eyrie, from Aerys Targaryen. Aerys had called for their heads, and rather than, you know, give them up, Jon Arryn had raised his banners in revolt, and that was the, you know, the start of Robert's rebellion. So that makes for an even better argument that Ned would name Jon Snow after Jon Arryn, because like Jon Arryn was protecting Ned and Robert from King Aerys, Ned was protecting Jon Snow from Robert. But anyway, moving on. So Ned is hit really hard with this information that Jon Arryn has died because he was like a father to him. But we also learn that Jon Arryn was married to Catelyn's sister Lysa Tully. So Ned, knowing that Lysa's husband has just died, encourages Catelyn to go visit her sister, fill her halls with noise and shouts and laughter, and to you know, get her sister through this grieving process because her husband's just died. But Catelyn can't go visit Lysa. Would that I could, Catelyn said. The letter had other tidings. The king is riding to Winterfell to seek you out. It took Ned a moment to comprehend her words, but when the understanding came, the darkness left his eyes. Robert is coming here. When she nodded, a smile broke across his face. Catelyn wished she could share his joy, but she had heard talk in the yards. A direwolf dead in the snow, a broken antler in its throat. Dread coiled within her like a snake, but she forced herself to smile at this man she loved, this man who put no faith in signs. So, aside from Catelyn picking up on, this news of these deserters from the Night's Watch and men going missing on rangings, and her not really thinking, not really buying into this idea that it's the wildlings, she's also thinking about the direwolf that they had found earlier in the day and how in its throat was an antler. And of course, we don't learn it in this chapter, but we learn later on that the sigil of House Baratheon is a stag. And it's so frustrating because it's one of those moments where you're like, damn it, Ned, listen to your wife. If Ned just listened to his fucking wife, things would probably be a whole lot different. He probably wouldn't be dead at the end of the book, but, when do men ever listen to their wives? So Catelyn also delivers the news that Cersei, who is queen, is also coming with Robert. Her and the children are coming along. We learn that Cersei's family, House Lannister, Ned doesn't like the Lannisters because they didn't come to Robert's cause until it was almost a guarantee that he was going to win. So we're getting all of these little details, this background information on Robert's rebellion and about the kind of, touchy relationship between House Lannister and House Stark because of it. And Catelyn advises Ned, please, Ned, guard your tongue. The Lannister woman is our queen, and her pride is said to grow with every passing year. Ned, guard your tongue. Listen to your wife. She knows it's not the wildlings. She knows you gotta guard your tongue around the Lannisters. Ned's just all excited about Robert coming. Well, if the price for Robert's company is an infestation of Lannisters, so be it. And Catelyn is the only one who is, who is actually being smart about this. And the gardeners are here. Sorry, guys. Sorry about the gardening going on in my yard. But there is so much in this chapter that is heavy foreshadowing for what's going to come down the line. If Ned just fucking listened to Catelyn for once, none of the shit that happens later on the book would have happened had he just listened to her. Catelyn is a really complex character, and we see an entirely different side to her in Jon's second chapter, when he's going to visit Bran, who still hasn't woken from his coma and everything, and how horrible she is to him. But at the same time, you have to give her credit here because she's thinking on an entirely different wavelength than everybody else, and her instincts are fucking dead on. So I guess my gardeners want me to wrap this video up because it's probably already too long. Hopefully you guys can still hear me over the fucking gardening. Anyway, that's it. Those are my thoughts on Catelyn 1. It's a great chapter. She's an awesomely complex character. And fucking hell. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.